On August 8th, 1995, every person inside the Playtime Co factory became a target. The toys turned. The experiments that had been conditioned for years to forget they were ever human remembered something older than conditioning. What had been done to them, and who was responsible? The event the lore calls the Hour of Joy lasted long enough to empty the building. Huggy Wuggy in the lobby, Mommy Longlegs in the game station, the smiling critters in the halls of Playcare. Every floor, every department, every exit. The CCTV footage Poppy shows the player in Chapter 3 makes it look total. Everyone died. Except, that's not what the records say. The records say the employees disappeared. That's the word the lore uses consistently. Disappeared. Not killed, not confirmed dead. Disappeared. And for a company the size of Playtime Co., with the infrastructure it had built beneath that factory, with the number of people who had access to things regular employees never saw, a building full of people vanishing is not the same as a building full of people dying. Some of them might have gotten out, some of them might still be out there, and at least one of them might be the person playing the game. In this video, we're going to go through the scientists, the executives, the people the lore names and then doesn't account for, and ask what actually happened to each of them. We'll look at who survived in some form, who disappeared without explanation, and what some of the most interesting community theories say about where they went, including a theory about the player's identity that changes how the entire game reads. And we'll get into something the community doesn't discuss as much, the question of who funded all of this, and whether the answer to that question is bigger than Playtime Co. itself. Quick note before we start, none of what follows is confirmed lore. These are theories, ideas the community has been building from the details the game leaves open. The point isn't to arrive at an answer. The point is to sit with the right questions. What we know about the scientists. Playtime Co. wasn't run by one person. The structure that ran the Bigger Bodies initiative involved multiple departments and multiple people with enough clearance to know what was actually happening inside those labs. The names the lore gives us across 5 chapters are a specific group. Leith Pierre, the head of innovation and eventual chair of the company after Elliot Ludwig. Stella Graber, who appears in Chapter 4 documentation related to the initiative's oversight. Eddie Ritterman, who the lore places in the room when the decision to turn Harley Sawyer into an experiment was made. Bruno White, who was present for Sawyer's activation as Experiment 1354, and Harley Sawyer himself, who the game confirms survived the Hour of Joy in a form because he shows up in the master backup at the end of Chapter 5. That's 5 named individuals with senior level access. Let's go through what actually happened to each of them because the game treats them very differently. Sawyer is the easiest. He was already transformed into Experiment 1354 before the Hour of Joy happened. He wasn't a target in the same way because he was no longer recognizably human. His consciousness survived in the system, and by Chapter 5, a backup of that consciousness exists in the IT infrastructure. He didn't escape, he was already inside the machine. Bruno White's fate is not confirmed anywhere in the lore so far. He was present during Sawyer's activation in 1994, which puts him inside the facility in the year before the Hour of Joy. Whether he was in the building on August 8th is unknown. Whether he had reason to be somewhere else that day is unknown. He's one of the people the game introduces and then doesn't account for, which is either a gap in the storytelling or a deliberate space being held open. Stella Graber is similar. She appears in Chapter 4 documentation, is referenced as someone who was involved in the decision-making around the initiative, alongside Leith and Ritterman, and then her fate after August 1995 is simply not addressed. Eddie Ritterman is a different case, and honestly, the most significant one in this group, because the game actually gives you the answer. It just buries it in a cassette tape called Pierre/Ritterman, August 95. In that recording, Ritterman tells Pierre he'll be away from the factory inspecting the play park renovation site from August 7th to August 12th. The Hour of Joy happened on August 8th. He wasn't in the building. His survival isn't a theory, it's confirmed by the lore. And in that same tape, he tells Pierre to focus on the bigger picture. Overseas partners from Japan are up to speed, and they'll soon be more focused on that than the main factory. One line, barely a sentence, but it implies the initiative didn't end with the Hour of Joy, that the infrastructure extended internationally, and that Ritterman, who was alive when the factory went dark, had contacts running parallel operations somewhere else. Whether he's connected to whatever is happening in Tokyo by the time the game takes place in 2005, the lore doesn't say. Who definitely didn't make it. Before we get into survival theories, it's worth being clear about what the lore actually confirms as deaths, because not everyone is ambiguous. Jessica Newman is the clearest case. The restricted _salvation tape documents the prototype killing her directly. She was impaled. There's no ambiguity there. She's gone, and notably, she spent her final moments trying to shift blame onto Leith Pierre, which tells you something about the dynamics of that group even at the very end. The general staff, the floor workers, the guards, the researchers without senior clearance, the evidence throughout all 5 chapters is that they did not survive. The factory is full of their remains. The Hour of Joy tape shows what happened to the people in the lobby, the game station, the hallways. Preston Willard, who the orientation notebook gives a voice to across its pages, was confirmed to have been experimented on during the events documented in restricted _salvation. He didn't escape as a human. So, the question of survival applies specifically to the people who were senior enough to have known what was coming, senior enough to have had access to exit routes or safe rooms, or information about the factory's layout that regular employees didn't. And that's a short list. The transformation category. There's a third outcome that the game establishes clearly, and that tends to get underweighted in conversations about who survived the Hour of Joy. Some people didn't die and didn't escape. They were transformed. Gracie Green is the most recent example. Captured by the smiling critters, put into the Lily Lovebraid's body by the prototype, subjected to her own conditioning program for 122 days until her identity fractured. She is technically still alive in 2005 when Chapter 5 takes place, but the person she was is gone, or at least buried. Harley Sawyer is another version of this. His body was transformed into Experiment 1354 before the Hour of Joy, and his consciousness was preserved in the system afterward. By the end of Chapter 5, a backup version of him exists in the IT infrastructure. That's not death. It's a very specific kind of continuation that the game frames as both survival and punishment. The question this raises is, how many other people might exist in this category? The factory had the technology to transfer consciousness. The prototype had the ability to perform experiments after the Hour of Joy, which we know because he built Lily from the Experiment 1468 design. If the prototype decided that some of the scientists were more useful transformed than dead, then there could be people from the original Playtime Company staff still present in the factory in forms that have no obvious connection to who they were. Somewhere in that building, a scientist might still be running. Leith Pierre and the player theory. This is where the survival question intersects with one of the most persistent theories in the community, and I want to spend some time on it because the evidence is more layered than it might look at first. Leith Pierre's name appears across every chapter of the game. VHS tapes, internal documents, decisions that required someone with serious clearance to approve. He was the head of innovation, the person who took over the company after Elliot Ludwig's death, the executive who signed off on the Bigger Bodies initiative alongside Sawyer. He knew everything. And then the Hour of Joy happens, and Leith Pierre is never confirmed dead. He's never confirmed as a survivor either. The orientation notebook, written by Preston Willard, references Pierre planning to send people back into the factory after the Hour of Joy, which at minimum means he survived long enough to make that plan. Whether he was alive when those plans were being made, or whether the notebook is referring to plans he had made before, is something the game leaves unresolved. Now, consider the protagonist. No face, no voice, no name. We know they were a former employee who received an anonymous letter in 2005 and returned to find the company's missing staff. That's the entire description the game gives you. Former employee, received a letter, came back. What kind of former employee gets a letter inviting them specifically to a factory that killed everyone who was in it a decade earlier, and goes? Not a floor worker, not someone who was there for the paycheck, someone who has a reason that goes beyond curiosity. Pierre fits the setup in ways that get uncomfortable the longer you sit with them. He had access to the Bigger Bodies initiative, to the orphan experiments, to the decisions that created Huggy Wuggy and Mommy Longlegs, and everyone else who's been hunting the player for 5 chapters. The toy's reactions to the player are not how you react to a random trespasser. Mommy Longlegs says employees deserve to die, not humans. Employees. Huggy goes after the player immediately. Poppy, who has been locked in a glass case for decades and has every reason to trust no one, cooperates. She lets the player approach from the start. None of that fits a stranger who wandered in. In Chapter 4, Harley Sawyer reviews security footage of the player and says he doesn't recognize them. The community has used this to argue against the Pierre theory, but Sawyer's security feeds are explicitly described as fuzzy and low quality. And there's a line in the tape connected to the player's identity that has been circulating in the community for a long time. "It was your doing that made us." That's not how you address a random trespasser. That's how you address someone who was in the room. The game never confirms this. Chapter 4 pushes back against it without fully disproving it. But the gap where Leith Pierre's fate should be is exactly the shape of the gap where the player's identity should be. That might be coincidence. In a game this carefully constructed, coincidences are worth examining. The government theory. Now, let's go somewhere the community doesn't talk about as much, because I think it deserves more attention than it gets. The scale of what Playtime Co built is not the scale of a private toy company. The factory is not one building. It's a multi-floor complex that goes deep underground with dedicated zones for production, experimentation, containment, a full school system in play care, a game station, a theater, residential areas for the experiments, and infrastructure capable of housing and maintaining dozens of living experiments for decades. The community has estimated the cost of the facility across all its floors and the systems required to run it at somewhere in the range of hundreds of millions of dollars. Some estimates go higher. That number matters. A toy company in the mid-20th century does not build a facility at that scale from toy sales alone. Even accounting for Playtime Company's popularity and the Bigger Bodies initiative's cost-cutting goals, the infrastructure required to run secret human experimentation on that scale, to maintain it for decades, to keep it hidden from public knowledge, requires resources and cover that go beyond corporate financing. Who funds something like that? And more importantly, who agrees to look away? The Bigger Bodies initiative involved turning orphaned children into experiments. Those children came from somewhere. Playcare was an on-site orphanage, which means Playtime Company had some kind of arrangement that allowed them to house and control orphans without external oversight catching what was happening to those children. That's not a private company operating in a vacuum. That's a private company operating with cover, and cover at that level doesn't come from nowhere. There's a line in Chapter 5 that doesn't get discussed enough. A tape connected to Eddie Ritterman references him having contacts in Tokyo and implies that the experiments are continuing in other locations. The Bigger Bodies initiative didn't die with the factory. Someone is still running it somewhere, and the resources required to continue that kind of operation in an international location suggest an entity with reach that a collapsed toy company no longer has. Who picked up where Playtime Co left off? Who had reason to want those experiments to continue and the infrastructure to make it happen? The game hasn't answered this. Chapter 5 introduces the Tokyo detail and then ends before unpacking it. But if you're looking for a reason why a facility of that scale existed and why it was protected for as long as it was, the most direct answer is that someone with government-level resources had an interest in what was being produced there. The Bigger Bodies initiative was, at its core, a program for creating large, obedient, expendable organisms with human-level cognition that could be controlled and deployed. That has applications well beyond toy manufacturing. Whether Playtime Co understood what they were building toward, or whether someone outside the company had been watching the initiative as a proof of concept for something larger, is a question the lore doesn't close. And if there's state-level involvement in what happened at that factory, then the Hour of Joy and its aftermath look different. A private company's catastrophic failure gets contained and buried. A government-backed experiment that went wrong gets managed. The employees don't just disappear. They get disappeared. The paper trail gets handled. The factory gets sealed. And 10 years later, someone sends a letter to a former employee asking them to go back in. Who benefits from that? Who wanted someone inside that building in 2005, pulling it together? Here's what the lore actually supports, stripped of speculation. At least one senior Playtime Co scientist survived the Hour of Joy in some form. Harley Sawyer, as a consciousness preserved in the system. At least one employee was transformed after the event, Gracie Green, in 1996. At least one executive's fate is entirely unaccounted for, Leith Pierre. The experiments continued somewhere after the factory was sealed. Someone sent the player a letter in 2005. The player has no confirmed identity. The toys react to the player in ways that don't match how they treat strangers. Each of those facts is in the game. The theory is what happens when you line them up and ask what's connecting them. Pierre survived, sent the letter, and is the one walking through the factory. The initiative continued with government backing, and the Tokyo operation is the proof. The people unaccounted for, Bruno White, Stella Graber, others the game hasn't fully named, are either dead, transformed, or somewhere in a chain of events that Chapter 6 hasn't shown us yet. None of this is confirmed. The game is deliberate about leaving exactly these questions open. What I find interesting is that it's been 5 chapters and the ambiguity hasn't resolved. The player's identity is still a gap. Pierre's fate is still a gap. The Tokyo line lands at the end of Chapter 5 and the chapter ends before anyone follows it. These aren't oversights. These are things the game is holding. The Hour of Joy is framed in the game as the event that ended Playtime Company. But the more you look at who's unaccounted for, the less clean that ending looks. Some people died. Some people were turned into the very thing they were studying. Some people disappeared in the way that means they left, not in the way that means they were killed. And whatever was being built in that facility, whether it was just the toys or something the toys were a step toward, the infrastructure for it apparently still exists somewhere. The Tokyo detail, just one line in a tape, is the most unsettling thing Chapter 5 adds to the lore. Not because of what it confirms, but because of how casually it drops the implication and then leaves it there. Someone funded this, someone protected it, someone kept the orphans coming, and after the factory went dark, someone apparently decided the work was worth continuing. Whether that's a corporation, a government, or something the game hasn't named yet, the answer to that question is probably going to change how everything before it reads. We just don't have it yet.